Hi, hello. I'm gonna very purposely not look at anyone because it's kind of terrifying. Um, right, let's just get straight into it. What is this talk about? Who's it for? I'm going to chat briefly about why it's important that we discuss and consider accessibility specifically in the horror genre. So I'm hoping that at least some people out there care about horror games, whether or not you're working on something that involves horror or you just like horror. For anybody who isn't interested, who is just like, this is not for me, go get a drink. But also there is a lot of crossover with other genres. So hopefully there will be some takeaways for some people that are useful because I will be delving into some ideas about what we can do to make games more accessible. So yeah. Um, my goal today is to get you thinking about the barriers that many horror games create for their player bases and to give you a few ideas around how we can break those down. And as I said, it will also have a lot of crossover with other games. As is a common thing that's actually come up in a lot of talks so far, and as with any game, regardless of genre, it's important to remember that we can't expect to make a game that meets everyone's accessibility needs. However, even small changes in the way we approach designing horror games can open them up to a whole new audience. So just to start off, who am I? Some of you might know me. Some of you probably have no idea who I am. So I am Lee Brady. My pronouns are they, them. I am a certified accessibility specialist, and I am also a horror, disability, and feminism academic. As well as this, I am also a horror game curator and content creator. And I previously worked at the Chinese Room, which some of you might know has delved into horror games a few times. And I am also now a indie game dev working on an unannounced project, which, big hint, is a horror game. Just before we get started, I want to have a quick talk about content and trigger warnings for this. There isn't anything too crazy or anything like that, but there will be blood and gore in some of the pictures. There will be violence in some of the pictures and disturbing imagery. So if this is uncomfortable for anyone, please, look away or get a snack. So I want to quickly talk about why it's important to talk about accessibility in horror. In a report by Scope in 2020, 66% of gamers with an impairment or condition said that they faced barriers or issues related to gaming. In fact, the origins of this talk actually came about when I met a good friend of mine for the first time, and we got talking about horror games because you can't meet me and not talk about horror games. They had a hearing impairment, and they explained to me that they couldn't really play horror games because they relied on a lot of audio cues for stingers and general scares. This got me thinking about the barriers that we have in horror games. At that point, I had never considered that this would be a problem for anyone. I just assumed that people played horror games or they didn't because some people don't like being scared, but it was actually a barrier for them. Oh, and I am just breaking everything. So I feel like for some people, not anyone in this room, uh, there is this idea of like, okay, well, no horror games for people who can't play them. And this is an incredibly dismissive take that alienates people from an entire genre. It's one of the few genres that isn't afraid to tackle important, heavy issues. Horror games can be a way to explore and understand those issues in a secure way. As an example for myself, horror has given me opportunities to explore themes around mental health and family in a way that's helped me process difficult emotions safely. One of the key things that's actually coming up quite commonly, both in academic spaces and in psychology, is the idea that horror games give players a space to experience fear and other emotions in a safe way, in a secure environment. Because obviously, you don't really want to be feeling those feelings in the real world because it's usually going to be quite dangerous. That is, however, a whole conversation in itself. The most important thing to take away from this is quite simply, like the name of the presentation and the talk, everyone deserves to be scared. So we've covered the why, Let's take a look at some of the more common core mechanics of horror games and how we can approach them in a way that makes them more accessible for the player. Now, this next bit is going to be very practical, just going to be talking about things that we tend to see in horror games and how we can actually look at them differently. It's more about designing games in a way that is accessible and approachable. But like I said earlier, a lot of it will have crossover with other genres. So first of all, I want to talk about puzzles. A staple of the genre, I think when a lot of us think about horror games, we think about puzzles. They're often used for progression, giving players a task to do in order to move on to the next part of the game. So the first thing I want to talk about is giving the player the option to adjust difficulty of puzzles, something that is not commonly done in many horror games anymore. But some people might know who are fans of the genre that Silent Hill 2 had a riddle level which allowed the player to adjust the difficulty of the puzzles in the game. Now, depending on the size of your studio and your project, this is a bit of a heavy task because when you're looking at this, that is 3 different ways that each puzzle has to be done. So it is worth taking into consideration your limitations, what you can do. But if you can implement a feature like this, it would be absolutely invaluable to people. The second point I want to bring up is alternate routes through your game where puzzles can be bypassed. Where have I put this? This is heavily determined by the kind of game you're making. For example, if you have combat, you can consider giving the player the option between a puzzle route and a combat route. If you don't have combat, it's a way to get you thinking about ways that you can bypass a puzzle. For example, it could be something that you give a player right from the start, like an item where they can just explode puzzles or something like every time they come across one. Giving them a choice. It can be a choice in the menu, like just when you start, or it can be something that you pick up on the way that you make it very clear to the player, hey, look, here's this little easy option to get through if you are not a puzzle player. Puzzles can be quite difficult for people with cognitive issues. And for me personally, I have quite a hard time with them. So it can really open up the game for them. And the third point I want to bring up is don't rely on single sense inputs for your puzzles. So what I mean by this is puzzles that rely on you using a single one of your senses, for example, visual cues or audio cues only. So puzzles that are like, listen to this song and replicate the sound. Or the big one for me that I actually wanted to talk about, I think is quite commonly used, is flashing lights, especially flashing light color puzzles. Came across this recently in a modern horror game where you had to remember a sequence that was colored lights. And it got me thinking, all right, well, if you've got color blindness or difficulty determining between different colors, you're going to have difficulty with this. If you have low vision or blindness, you're going to have difficulty altogether because there was no audio alternative or haptic or vibration alternative. And also in the memory and cognitive issues, which I literally just thought about on the spot. One of the key things to remember when you're making puzzles or any kind of element in your game which requires the player to progress is, and a common theme that's come up in talks so far, can somebody else do this? Can somebody without this ability do this? And now I will go on to combat. Now, this is a very, very specific thing that will only occur if you have combat in your game. So if you were working on a survival horror, for example. Right off the bat, combat shares a very similar point with puzzles, difficulty options. This is a more commonplace for games in general. You tend to have difficulty in a lot of games, and that usually refers to combat. But I want to hammer the point home that it is more than just enemy health, because this is a very particular point in horror games that changing the difficulty just changes enemy health. It's very important to consider how your enemies also hit the player. Having less health is useless if you've got an enemy that's going to hit you in 1 or 2 hits. You're still going to be going down constantly. Think about also adjusting enemy abilities for different difficulties. Harder difficulties have more offensive skills. Easier difficulties would have less offensive skills. If you give a player the freedom to customize their experience, they will adjust it to what they need. I think one of the key topics that comes up about difficulty a lot is people thinking, oh, you're making the game too easy for people. People are just going to go through the game. Players will play the game how they want to. That's the whole point of giving them options. So giving them this ability to, adjust the game in a way that works for them means that it's more accessible for everybody. Nobody is going to play a game and go, I'm going to put it on the easiest difficulty, knowing that that's going to be too easy for me. That's just not, in my experience, that's not how people play. Another key point I wanted to bring up is weapon variation. I think this is an overlooked element of accessibility because it plays a huge part. It allows for different play styles, and this is also about the discussion around approachability and accessibility. It opens up your game to more players. Very key one here is in a lot of survival horrors, you will have ranged and you will have melee. For me personally, I can't do range stuff at all. But if you give me a plank of wood to hit somebody with a single button, sure, no problem. And that is also the same for not just people who have disabilities or conditions, but also people of different ages. I have parents who are in their 60s who play video games. They can't shoot guns for the life of them, but they can hit a single button and smack things. And the third point, very similarly again to puzzles, is think about non-combat routes for players who may struggle with combat. One of the key things here is to try to avoid just giving an option in a menu that says skip combat or auto fighting. Think about adding an in-game route that doesn't require combat. One of the key things that comes up a lot in accessibility conversations around games, and this is not just specific to horror, is that a lot of people who play games can get quite frustrated with just having content skipped rather than getting to actually experience the game. People want to play your game. So having alternate routes is a way that you can actually open it up to more people and make sure that they don't miss anything, especially if you have key beats that are involved in things like combat. If you want them to still walk through the area, have different routes. Moving on from combat, we're going to talk about the one big thing in horror games specifically, which is scares. I'm going to find this on my little thing. So yeah, I want to start off with the type of scares that we include in our games. This is a very, very specific portion. Try and include a variation of scares. Better yet, ensure each scare can be experienced multiple ways. The easiest one is sound and visual. Most of the time, if you're going to throw a dead body in front of a player, you're going to have a noise about it going on at the same time. But sometimes, if you rely specifically on just visual, just audio, somebody else who isn't going to be able to experience that is just going to miss the scares altogether. And the whole point of a horror game is to scare someone or to give them a sense of dread. They don't necessarily have to be scary, scary, but scares are bad. And one of the next points is making sure that the player can actually engage in your scares. So focusing the player on a scare can ensure they aren't missed if certain elements can't be experienced. Um, my experience of this is from Silent Hill Homecoming, where you could walk down a corridor, and if you turned around, you could still trigger a scare where a body fell from the ceiling, but there was no audio cue whatsoever. So the player is looking away from what you actually want them to see. There's no audio, and you turn around and you're just sort of looking at this like swaying body. It wasn't, it's not very scary because there was no audio, there was no indication that it was happening, and also because the player didn't get to experience it popping up. So one of the things is focusing the player. Now, this can be very difficult because you don't really want to take control away from the player. So think about elements like lighting and colors. I'm not necessarily talking about yellow paint, but do slight things in your environment that will lead players where you want them to go. And especially if you have scares that you want to be very specific. So if you're like, here's a little cupboard, not everybody's going to go in this cupboard, but the people who do are going to get scared. Then make sure that you have something that's leading them, like a glow coming from it, making sure that they focus on it, that they can see what you actually want them to see. And the big one for me, I think, in terms of scares is consider alternative to jump scares or providing the player the option to opt in or out of jump scares as part of their experience. So this is actually something that is coming up a bit more often, which I absolutely love, is having the option to turn jump scares off. There was a game recently, I can't remember what it was, but it was an indie game that did it. It was absolutely fantastic because it meant that I could play the game because I can't handle a lot of jump scares. So This is very, very important because there will be a lot of people who want to engage with your game who have not just cognitive issues, but mental health issues, triggers that might happen if you are shocking them and scaring them all of a sudden. So definitely consider giving them the option to choose. And the last main thing I want to talk about, and is also something I did in this presentation, is warnings. Now, for fans of the genre, a lot of us have probably seen brilliant warning screens that you would see in classic survival horror games, specifically things like Silent Hill. We've got Dino Crisis. This is also Silent Hill. Um, this was my first ever experience of one of these, and they're very cool because they tell you what you're playing, what you're going to be experiencing. Over time, this has become a bit more of a trend rather than something that is an actual warning. So in a lot of indie games specifically, they will try to replicate these little warning screens, but they're mostly doing it for the aesthetic. They're not actually giving you information. It's just saying things like, some parts of the game may be considered violent or cruel, but that game might also have really heavy topics like suicide. And the idea that you're not including that information to the player is actually quite harmful. The key to making your warning triggers and content warnings is that you can do it in a cool way. You can still do those very, very cool, this may be a violent or cruel game, but make sure you're giving the player the exact information you need. Take a look online at common trigger warnings and content warnings. If you're talking about very heavy topics, especially mental health, which comes up a lot in horror games, you want to include that information there. If the game features a lot of heavy content, try to direct players to a separate content warning area in the menu for a full list of information. I actually want to refer to the wonderful talk that was just on about having lots of information on screen. This became a bit of a trend with modern horror games where we would see massive warning and then just lists and lists and lists of content information of like what this game entails, which legally is, I get it, but it goes so quickly and people don't have the time to actually look and consider. And personally, I just skip it. I'm like, okay, there's bad stuff in this game. And then you're halfway through and then you have something like a horrible experience because you don't quite realize what's happening. This is a really good way to make sure that everybody gets all the information they need. And to hammer this point home, you're not hurting your player. Horror games have a tendency to potentially trigger people for a lot of things, and you just want to make sure you're not hurting anyone. You want people to play your game, you want them to experience it, you don't want them to have a bad time. And I sort of ran through that all a bit quick. So, quick recap of everything that I've just covered. Give the player freedom to personalize their experience. That is key. As much customization as possible, but also consider your limitations. Again, like I said earlier, if you have a smaller project, a smaller studio, of course, you're going to be limited. So consider that, but try and give them as much freedom as you can. Players will always pick what they need. They're not just going to be like running through your game thinking, oh, I'm super strong or anything. People want to have an experience. A lot of people actually do want to have a challenge, but they also want it to be within their means. It's as simple as that. And that goes for all games, really. Puzzle difficulty, non-puzzle routes can be a great consideration for players with cognitive difficulties. Alternative play styles and routes throughout your game will make your game more enjoyable and accessible. Consider scares that account for multiple senses at once, and also either avoid jump scares or give people options to opt out of them. And I can't even read that. Warn your players about content and potential triggers. Horror games tackle some pretty heavy stuff. And that's me. So if anybody wants to chat to me about horror games or anything like that, I'm on all of these things. My blue sky is a little bit unhinged, so pick your poison. Um, other than that, yeah, thank you. This was terrifying, just like the horror games.